It's a pleasure and honor to introduce Catherine Skinner. She will give a little bit of a theoretical framework, after which there will be a very brief panel introduction, and then it is really an open discussion. So, thanks.
All right, hopefully that is on. Okay, so yesterday we had a provocative end to Amy's keynote, and I actually want to start us back there with a question that was posed regarding whose responsibility it ultimately is to exact change. So the question was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the question was roughly, the funders say that they're looking to the community for direction. The publishers say that they're looking to editors and researchers for direction. And the researchers say we're looking to the funding agencies and to the publishers to tell us what we're supposed to do, which means that we're at kind of an impasse. Or that was the way that it was framed. And there was also the question and maybe suggestion of, is there a kind of pointing of fingers going on here that moves the responsibility around? I want to posit that we're all responsible, and that one of the things that even that question illustrates is that each one of those groups has intertwined relationships. And so as we start this funding panel, which will turn into mostly a discussion, and mostly a discussion with the audience, I want all of us to kind of be mindful of our own roles in this, because the funding is not just the domain of the funders. It's also the domain of the community that helps to peer review the applications. It's about those who are setting policy. It's about those who are creating systems. There are lots of different layers to this, and we can't look at the funders as though they can either solve our problems or, that's not the purpose of this panel. But where I actually want to start is very quickly with 2 seconds about who I am, so that I'm positioning myself for you, because I'm not a funder. Even though I was listed as Edutopia, which would have put me in the George Lucas camp, which would be very cool, I actually run a very tiny, and I mean very tiny, 501c3 called the Educopia Institute. And I'm charged by mission with thinking deeply about how to catalyze change and how to encourage communities within the kind of cultural, scientific, and scholarly communities to improve their business practices. These are business practices, whether we term them that or not, on a regular basis within these communities. That's what drives my work at Educopia. It's also what drove my scholarship as a scholar. So my background is in sociology and American studies, and you'll see that color and flavor of what I'm doing today. So I want to start the talk, though, with a tigress. And this is not just any tigress. This is a tigress named Mohini. She was brought into the U.S. as a gift in President Eisenhower's time, and she was deposited at the Smithsonian Zoo. So curatorially speaking, the Smithsonian Zoo in that time was comprised of cages. I mean, we were still in those days of zoos. And so she was put in a 12 by 12 cage in the lion's den. And the, Mohini the tiger paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what she did all the time. And the zoo was interested in different types of habitats for animals, as most zoos, became during this era. And so they built her this beautiful, spacious area, and they were so excited, totally delighted to let her into it and see what she does. Will she nap? Will she pounce? Where will she play? When they put her in, she claimed a 12 by 12 section of that new multi-acre environment and paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, wearing out the ground. So she does eventually break out. So, you can go to the New Scientist 1984 article on her, and she does break out. But this tells us a lot about habituation, which is a sociological principle, and it's one that I think we see in action in all sorts of ways in our own world, in scholarly communications. So although there have been lots of changes, and funding has helped to prompt some of those, all of the scholars in this room have helped to prompt those, etc., there's also a lot of stasis, and there's a lot of isomorphism, and there's a lot of rigidity and obeying of these kind of 12 by 12 confines that we were in a print era, and that we really can move well beyond. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. This was, after all, the Beyond the PBF conference originally. But isomorphism is not where we want to stay. We don't want to stay in the same kind of habituated patterns. We don't want to be a Mohini. So let's pivot to talk about how we get out of that. And there I turn to sociology. And sociology tells us a lot about fields of practice and how new fields of practice emerge, how existing fields of practice transform. And whether you're talking about banking or the railroad industry, whether you're talking about the music industry, which was my field of study prior to taking on this nonprofit, or whether you're talking about scholarly communications, the number one thing we know about institutions is that they don't form in permanent ways. They may look very stable, but they never form in permanent ways. What can exact change in these institutions is moments when things within the cultural and environmental context are shifting. And sociology tells us that one of the most powerful motivators for those kinds of broad level changes at institutions and within fields of practice is when the change is in the mode of communication. Sound familiar? We've had lots of those over the last 20 years. So we're in a time where, of course, we're experiencing a lot of potential for change. However, there are also a lot of potentials for staying fairly habituated for long periods of time, which we also see. I mean, text-based scholarship still dominates the universe right now. But the other things that sociology brings to our attention in terms of how we might see change happen and how change might be quickened come down to two very important factors. One, that it's not usually going to happen from the center of any industry. The center is disincentivized by nature because the center is already benefiting from the existing system. So whether consciously or unconsciously, they do resist change. And a lot of large corporations now understand this and are trying to find ways to break out of that by working with fringe groups, which is actually where you usually see major change happen. The final principle that I'll pull out of sociology that I just want us to have kind of in the back of our heads as we go into this panel is that fringe agents, it's not a lone innovator, it's not a lone genius out there somewhere who creates a change. It always, always, always gets informed by networks of people. So it's the networks of production, reception, and distribution that ultimately allow for change to move from the fringes to the center. So innovations can happen aplenty without ever impacting the larger system. If we want to impact the system, you have to have a formal network to do it. Now, where that comes back into the conversation today, and where I'd like for this to help kind of shape the parameters maybe at the start of the conversation, is that we are a system. And I think one of the things that I was attracted to when I found out about Force 11 was the idea that this is a multi-stakeholder initiative. But I came into this from another multi-stakeholder initiative that was studying how to build a good, solid, what we were calling VERAs in a Mellon-funded project that Martin Halbert has co-PI'd with me for the last year, and Christina, who many of you have probably met here, was project managing for us. And what we were studying there was one very specific type of stakeholder interaction, and could we encourage some new types of growth by doing these multi-stakeholder interactions. And what we found is, as we started to canvass the landscape, we knew there were some. We didn't know how many. And we didn't realize how many of them didn't know about each other. So, most of the people in this room know there's also RDA, but there are dozens and dozens of multi-stakeholder initiatives all going forward right now at the same time. We have a lot of collective networks. The question is, how do collective networks actually transform practice? And this is what I think we've been bumping up against repeatedly in the last few days. I've certainly felt that that's part of what I'm bumping up against when I'm grappling with some of the questions that have been raised. We're raising all sorts of very important questions, but do we have the right people in the room to actually solve those? Do we know how to take the first steps to move things forward? And where is the responsibility level from individuals to fund this, from funding agencies to fund this, from the commercial sector to fund this? And how do we bridge communities in a realm where that's not what we can turn to a funding agency to do? So I want to start us with, I'm throwing this term out here. It's not meant to be a model for us to grapple with today, but there is a model that is about trying to unite lots of different stakeholder groups around a common core moving towards system change that is called collective impact. So I just want to give the disclaimer that there is something named that out there. Some of the things that are hallmarks of it are things that I think are also hallmarks of what has been started in this group. So things like forming a common agenda, figuring out what is that big picture change that we want to see happen, and what are some of the intermediate steps that we need to take in that direction. We think about what kinds of shared measurement might be able to help us move towards those goals. So how can you evaluate that between Force 11 in 2011 and now there's been progress made towards some of the goals that this community has started to set out? We also talk about mutually reinforcing activities, so making sure that there's alignment between all of the stakeholders and that each one of the groups is talking as it's moving forward. And then finally, we have continuous communications, which I think do come through, at least in these annual conferences, and also through some of the other activities that are going on. The question is, what supports this? What is the backbone? Is it a nonprofit? Is it that there is a concentrated group of work groups that keep activity coordinated? How does that get funded? How does that help to transform? So just as one example of things that we might talk about in the next hour, I challenge us all to think about what roles we play as the different stakeholders that do have an impact on where we're going, whether we're the funder or the funded, whether we're the ones that are trying to form communities, or whether we're doing projects that interrelate with communities. How are we going to make this work as time goes on? So with that, I will go ahead and invite the panel to come on up and the moderators to come on up.
Thank you. Let's thank Catherine for a moment. Thanks very much, and that's fantastic. And exactly, I think it feels a little odd to be the objective study for once, but it's very interesting, I think, to have somebody who actually studies what we do. So next we'd like to take a couple of, we'd like each of the funders, oh, we forgot to say Chris Menzel unfortunately fell ill. So he is unfortunately not at the panel. He had to tend to his illness, so I'm very sorry about that, but he was going to be here. Oh, sorry. We'd like to start, starting with Josh, I think, just give the folks here a couple of moments to say, if they wish, something either in response to this or in general, and then we will open it up for questions.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Josh Greenberg. I'm a program director at the Sloan Foundation. I feel like a good place to start, actually, is just a brief minute or two about sort of my scope and what my work is at the foundation. I always try to, I think opportunities like this are good to demystify what seems to happen behind the curtain of funding, and it's one of the things that we've talked about, hoping to do a bit of now. So excuse me, I'm one of 6 program directors at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So the Sloan Foundation's been around for 80 years. For those less familiar with the model of a private foundation, they're particularly common, I think, in the United States, and there are sort of broader political reasons, but we've been around 80 years. We have an endowment that ultimately came from Alfred Sloan, who was the guy who figured out how to run General Motors and did 3 things with his fortune. He endowed the first modern business school at MIT, the Sloan School, went in with his partner Boss Kettering and created the Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute, and what was left over became the core that's been stewarded and used for 80 years to support the Sloan Foundation. I was brought in about 4.5 years ago to run basically a new program at the foundation called Digital Information Technology, and it came from a realization from my president and some of my colleagues that certain issues, these are my words, not theirs, certain issues of computation on data at greater scale, use of digital networks for scholarly communication, we're starting to show up in all of our programs. We have basic research programs in the natural and social sciences, a public understanding of science program, a STEM education program, and really all of them were grappling with some of these sort of systemic technological issues. So I was brought in, to build a new vertical funding program. I have my own budget, I make grants, there are some grantees here in the room, and I also am the utility infielder at the Sloan Foundation, working with my colleagues when issues of data management, data strategy. Last year we released a requirement for an appendix on information products, really inspired by the data management plan requirement and other things. And so I drafted that and worked really with colleagues across the foundation. So I have an interesting perspective, because on one hand I am a funder and I'm making grants really explicitly trying to help support the kinds of things we've talked about here and that you're all working on. And I spend a big chunk of my time working with my colleagues for whom these aren't the top priority, figuring out how to best position them so they're of use to their respective programs. I think I'll leave it there and pass the mic.
Thank you. I always wondered how Sloan worked. So I'm Amy Friedlander. You know quite a bit about my background and what I do. I think there are 2 topics about the NSF that, following Josh's lead, we might pull the curtain back a bit on. And one has to do with the federal budget, and the second one has to do with how the NSF operates, how we're staffed. So let's start with the second one first, the people. As many of you may know, NSF relies heavily not only on volunteers to do our panels for merit review, which is a foundational issue for us, a foundational approach for us, but we also rely heavily on rotators to staff our program staff. That is to say that NSF scientists at any given time, approximately 40% of them will have rotated in for 1 or 2 years to serve as a program officer at the NSF. So that's a good thing because it tightens our relationship with the universities we serve, and it also allows us to stay fresh and to bring new ideas in, and at the same time to deepen awareness of how the NSF works when the rotator goes back to his or her home institution. However, for managers, as you can imagine, having 40% turnover in your staff every 1 to 2 years kind of is a destabilizing influence. It is also the case that you might start out your program with your award with 1 program officer and end up with a 2nd or a 3rd, depending on the duration of the award. So this introduces an element of instability. It makes it fresh. It makes it permeable. We have good relationships with our awardee institutions. However, it also means that it is a bit unstable, and you have a steep learning curve for the program officers when they come in. As Josh, shared with me, it takes you a year or 2 to learn to do your job. I've changed. I get twitchy. Oh, come on. I've had a highly checkered career, and I would share that. It takes you at least a year to get comfortable in doing your job. So that's one element of the NSF to remind you of. And the second one is the federal budget. You start the federal budget approximately 2 years before the appropriation actually hits the street, assuming the appropriation hits the street on October 1st of the year. So, that means for FY15, which is where we are, in theory, that started in October of 1st of 14, that's this year, but we actually began to prepare that budget in the spring of 13. So if you wonder why we seem to be a little slow, that is one major reason. Now, I can give you a pointer and you can cure your insomnia and read up on all the gory details of how this actually works. There are a long process of collecting information and submitting this to Office of Management and Budget. Funding becomes available, submits that budget to the Congress, which then makes the appropriation. Remember, in the US system, building on the English model, funding is made by the Congress, not by the executive.
Okay, I'm Liz Allen. I'm Head of Evaluation at the Wellcome Trust, based in London. We, like the Sloan Foundation, are an endowed charity, for those of you who haven't come across us. We were formed, actually I've just worked it out, 79 years ago, so we're not quite as old as the Sloan Foundation, but we're nearly as old. So there was obviously something going on in the 30s with lots of rich people leaving their money to trust. So Henry Wellcome was actually an American pharmaceutical entrepreneur, and he had interests in biomedical science, but the whole range. So interests in biomedical science ranging from basic biomedical science through clinical research through to the history of medicine and society and ethics. So we do fund across the board. We do fund humanities and arts work and those kinds of social sciences and humanities work, but it is related to biomedicine in terms of the context. We spend around £700 million a year on research, so we are pretty big. We spend predominantly between 80 to 85% of that in the UK, and we mainly fund into the universities in the UK. We do fund the Sanger, Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, which is a genomics research institute. That's a Wellcome Trust funded research institute, but we mainly fund in universities. We do fund outside the UK as well. Just a couple of stats just to give some idea about the order of magnitude and just in terms of the size and how we need to use these kinds of infrastructures that we're talking about today to support the researchers. We've got around 3,000 active grants at any one time. We calculated that we employ at least 10,000 people on those grants, although it's fairly hard to do because the infrastructure to capture that data isn't there. So it's something that I'm really interested in, that kind of data. A lot of those won't be the PIs, so if you can look at the ratio of that, it's around 3,000 grants, but there's at least 10,000 people employed on those grants. You can see lots of different ranges of activity on those grants. So basically, we need efficiencies in science. So we don't have a funding program that's specifically about funding infrastructure like Josh, but we do fund some direct activities, and I guess it's something that we're very interested in. We've been very keen on the whole open access and data infrastructure support. We also support eLife and Europe PMC, so we've been involved in that kind of arena for quite a while.
Hello everyone, I'm Phil Bourne. I'm the Associate Director for Data Science at the National Institutes of Health. Till about 9 months ago, I was a professor at UC San Diego, and so I was essentially asking myself for money, I guess. So I see both sides of the equation, and I'll just say one thing about my current role is in the time I've been there, in the 9 months I've been at the NIH, I have to say that I've got a completely new, it's sort of lifting the curtain, but I put it as opening a window that I think all of you should have the opportunity to look into, of how there's such a dedicated group of people who work so hard to try and maximise the funding that comes out and to use it in the best possible way to move things forward. I just wouldn't say I fully appreciated that before. And of course, when you don't get funded, you don't necessarily see it that way, but you know, that's an unfortunate quirk of the system, but these are people who are really working for you. But it is a complex ecosystem, and I'll just give you one little story to illustrate that, and then I'll pass the mic, because I'm really interested. Actually, I'm not even going to tell you that story. I'm speaking again later, so maybe I'll do it then. But I think what I really want to do is to hear from you, the audience, and I'm very interested in the kind, don't say fund me, fund me, fund me. I'm very interested in the kinds of things that we should be funding, the areas that we should be funding. Because before, you know, when I was helping with the funding of Force 11, it was actually very difficult to get funding for these kinds of activities. And if it wasn't for the Sloan and the Moore Foundations, we'd be really stuck. But I think other agencies, the fact that we're all here, that's coming around. So I think you could really inform us for some of the things that we should be thinking about trying to fund.
So at that, and thank you very much, I'd like to open it up for questions, and otherwise we can start discussing Phil's question of what do you want us to fund. But if there are any burning questions, let's start there. So there's, I think, 3 hands. Do you guys have a mic up there? Oh, sorry, you got the mic. So yeah, right up front. Yeah. Go ahead. Could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, Tom Gillespie, UCSD, PhD student. So to segue from the last panel, one of the figures that was put up was the number of students and people who leave early in their career. And I wonder if that is not the best data we have, that we are overfunding education.
Anybody want to take that? Yeah, go for it.
I'll have a second.
I'm not going to take a formal position about whether we're overfunding education. I will say, if you're interested in these issues, one of the best things that I would suggest you read is a book called How Economics Shapes Science by Paula Stefan. She's a historian of science and economist who is really interested in the dynamics. She has a lot to say about how we fund different stages of scientific training, particularly the reliance on graduate or even particularly postdoc, which these days are cheaper than graduate students to employ in a lot of ways. And she has a lot of very interesting and very compelling things to say about the ways that might be restructured at a systemic level.
I'm not sure it's a direct answer to your question, but I mean, I think, and I have to say this relates more to biomedicine than other areas, but there's no question, and so much has been written about this quite recently, and you've probably seen some of these papers by some of the leaders, is that the system essentially went through a period of rapid growth and large doubling of budgets, in fact, from 98 to 2005. And then, of course, none of us, and again, this comes back to the notion that we need to do this collectively as a group, but none of us really fully appreciated the fact that this was unsustainable. And we all see it talking about, sustainability, but the fact is we didn't sustain the system. So what happened is it was clear that that couldn't continue to grow, and we see that now, that budgets are flat across whatever the funding agencies for the most part. And at the same time, institutions took advantage of this and grew rapidly, expanded their faculty, and now, of course, they're having great difficulty trying to keep it up. So there's now this kind of readjustment going on in the system. And I think the saddest part of all of this is the graduate students and the young people who actually potentially suffer greatly from this. I think about, it's a long time ago when I was a graduate student, but it was a different world. And I think it's very unfortunate we're in this situation.
Can I ask a follow-up to that really quickly? And I'll just try and shout so I don't need a microphone. Is the flip side of that coin that we're underfunding the transitional mechanisms for people to move into sort of academic positions and independent positions? And with NIH, there's the K99 mechanism, but it seems to be a very narrow vision. And if you do something different, like many of the people here, you're not a traditional sort of research track, then you're almost cut off from a lot of these sort of transitional mechanisms to getting into independent positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and I think most funders are trying to get better at sort of career tracking the people, particularly at the more junior mobile end, what happens to the people that we funded, mainly because from a Wellcome Trust perspective, we have PhD programs, we have people who are coming in, we want them to stay in science and build capacity and be the leaders of the future, but we also appreciate it's really valuable that the science literate population are moving into different professions, so we don't see leaving academia as a failure, but we do see that there are some issues with keeping people who would like to stay. We need to work a bit harder on making sure that there are mechanisms and funding routes for people to stay in different contexts and will indeed come back in later. We are starting to see people who left academia coming back in, and that's quite an interesting way to sort of look at people learning different skills in different sectors, taking their scientific knowledge with them, moving around a lot. So we are seeing that, but I don't think we'd see that we're overtraining. I think we don't see that.
Just to add to what's been said, with which I agree, is first of all, this is a topic that's been, I've heard, hotly debated over the last several years. It's not just is the pipeline broken, is the labor force right-sized and rightly distributed, I think is the way we would prefer to talk about it. And there are a couple of pieces to that. One is the transitional funding. And yes, NSF has programs to help young faculty make the transition from graduate student status or postdoc status into faculty positions. But I think there's a broader question that we've just heard discussed, which is that the prestige system that you come up with, prioritizes the academic appointment, whereas you would have a much healthier science enterprise if there were multiple paths in which to be a scientist. And taking one of those paths was not seen as the B+ route, but was seen, as we say about software, as a first-class object. So there's a science enterprise, the Society of Science dimension of this that is very hard to change.
Thanks. So thanks very much. I want to move on to the next question by Paul, and then we have Melissa, and then Cameron. Other people? All right. So we got the next 5. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask a question around this visibility question into the metrics. Do you feel like you have enough visibility into what the research programs that you funded or the researchers are doing now? And are there ways that we as a community could help improve that visibility such that you can make a case to, my congressman from Florida, right? So, for example.
Over here.
Okay,
Next one's up here.
That's a really, really good question. And I think funders, we've struggled for a long time to basically track what happens to the research that we fund and how to get information. And what's tended to happen, I think, is we've tended to seize on the things that are easier to count. So there's been a big culture of, counting publications and doing all the kinds of bits of bibliometric analysis and that kind of thing. I think what we also see, and one of the big issues for us is all the sort of incremental kind of null negative findings, all the stuff that isn't out there immediately in the public domain, all the kind of softer things. Somebody talked about the qualitative narrative around what happens to the research, the actual research story. That's all not very accessible to funders. There are various systems where you can get that from, but I would really like to see more collaboration across the different tools that you see. Well, so at Wellcome, we're using Altmetric, we're using PubMed, we're using an online tool that we get the researchers to fill in ourselves. We're trying to piece it all together. We're also working quite hard with ORCID to see if we can use that as a source system so that we can drag stuff and link stuff from the researcher directly to the research in the first place, and not having to burden the researcher with them keep telling us what they've done. So that's kind of a big political issue for us, is to reduce researcher burdens as well. But I do think this community could really help bring some of the products of research that aren't just the stellar stories that appear in a publication to the funders, and then we can start to use that in strategy. But at the moment we are quite hampered by what is out there and what's easily accessible to us, and then linking it to the funding is not an easy task.
Only to say essentially the same thing. And there's a whole group at the NIH that works on portfolio analysis, and they are increasingly using these tools, Altmetrics and a whole range of other things, to try and assess what it is that we're funding. And that's sort of one of the perhaps few advantages of being in a tight funding situation, is that there's much more scrutiny on how you spend every penny. And it's
I'm not so interested about assessment, but about visibility to you. Do you feel like you know what's going on in your program?
If you hadn't just come from the academy, would you know what's going on?
I mean, I think, maybe I'm still not understanding the question, maybe I'm just so jet lagged, but I mean, I come from Hawaii. But I came from the weather. But, I mean, I think there is a growing awareness of what's going on, and but I think there needs to be adjustments, and there needs to be better use of these things.
Yeah, actually, if I could. Something else that I just add, which I think is important, because I keep thinking about who's not sitting up here and what's not represented, because there's one way that your question is answered, which is what particularly conventional funders, state funders, and the major sort of private philanthropic funders of basic research across the humanities, social sciences, the sort of demand from us for better data. There's another framing to that, which is the offices of sponsored programs, the vice presidents, vice provosts for research, who are trying to figure out how to make the case, not necessarily to us who have structured funding programs, whether it's an open call or at Sloan we don't take unsolicited proposals, but there's still a structure for approaching us. But at least one of the things we're seeing in the States is frankly, more funding for basic research is coming from individual donors, from people who aren't even as established as us. And so my colleague Daniel Goroff at the Sloan Foundation, who runs the economics program, is really interested in questions about how do you better articulate the value of investments in basic research, because we've got to have better ways of making those arguments. That works on an individual the grant by grant perspective, but also we need the way to roll it up into making the argument for how the broader enterprise is funded and how it should be.
So I think there is another element of your question that perhaps we haven't gotten to, which is how do we see into what you're doing, and do we see enough? And the answer to that is probably no, we don't see enough, and it's very hard. So at the NSF, we rely on sort of two broad mechanisms, and if there's any former NSF program officers or current program officers in the room who would like to chime in, please feel free, and I'm looking at one of them. One way is the way you communicate with your program officer. This is what I'm doing, both formally and informally. I got a publication out, I did this, that, and the other thing. And the other one on campus is from the Public Information Officer to our Public Information Office of Legislative and Public Affairs, OLVA. And that's sort of our public face of what we've done. And it solves the problem about legal restrictions about what we are allowed to say to Capitol Hill and so on and so forth. So, this can be demeaned as this is happy talk and pretty stories, but, stories are a really powerful mechanism. So, the better the story, the better off we all are. So, it's a story in a journalist's sense, right? You don't have to tell a fairy tale. necessarily. And it doesn't have to be happy talk, but you have to talk about what you've done, and you have to talk to us. And it would be very nice, and we had a chat over this about lunch. It would be very nice if you talk to your communities. So it's not just the walled garden of the funders, but go to the science fair, go to the PTA, go to the Kiwanis, go to whatever the local agencies are, and talk about what you do.
Great. We have a queue of speakers, and we'd also like to make sure that we get on to the question about what should we be funding. So the order that I've got right now is Melissa, and then Cameron, and then over here. But we would also like very much if we could also think about the questions about, what should we be funding as well. And then I'm seeing some other hands which we'll put on the next list now. Yeah.
No, okay. My question is, so in coming to this conference and bringing people to this conference, this conference is cross-disciplinary. It's technology. It's very innovative. It's a great place to go to learn about what we should do next in our respective fields and to learn from other people in other fields. However, none of my funding streams, ethically, can I put any of the travel on this award because my awards are funded to do specific kinds of research. And so I'm wondering, how do we pay for Force 11 type of activities? How do we pay for bringing these types of communities together to do the work that we know needs to be done?
So it actually relates back to the difficulty I had trying to help fund Force 11 when I was actually on the other side of the fence. It is difficult, and I've learned in part that there are, and it depends, everyone has each agency or each group has different rules and regulations, but it's actually relatively hard to fund a community or people to participate in a community. And we've been having some discussions about that. I report directly to Francis Collins, who's the director of NIH, and we've been talking about the kinds of things we can do to support communities in ways that we haven't done before. Typically the way that happens now is that supplemental grants are given to someone who happens to have a grant from someone else who's actually a key player in the community, and then those funds are used to fund the community itself. And that sort of works, but it's not the whole answer. And I know other agencies have got better schemes, but that's where as far as I'm aware of, where we're at.
Different agencies do have sponsorship calls as well. You can apply for sponsorship for various conferences.
I guess my question is more like, how do we get us to do the work that we know we identify together? Because it just doesn't seem to fall under most RFAs.
I guess I'll say something. Yeah. So, but what's tricky is, and this is the situation that a place like Sloan is in, because it's partly like the level of our annual budget is a drop in the bucket of some others on stage, and so what and at the same time we have the privilege of being very agile in certain ways, and so we understand our role as helping to seed, helping to start, helping to give a runway, and I think there's no one answer to the question of how do you take it from there. I wouldn't presume to sit here and have the answer. In the end, one way or another, one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is institutionalization, and that can happen at different levels. One of the things that some colleagues of mine that I've learned from some colleagues of mine is the fact that you can tell I'm hanging out with economists now in a way that my academic training sort of wasn't necessarily, that institutions exist to solve collective action problems. That the way we fund a lot of the things that we talk about, in the end, a lot of the revenue streams that fund the things we've been talking about today come through libraries. And libraries are funded through a tax levied on individual research programs, as well as, in certain cases, sort of historic endowments or other things. And so libraries as institutions exist to help pay for things that, there might be a collective action problem that we wouldn't necessarily pay for themselves. There are other structures like that. and I don't have a clear answer, of where this fits in a particular grant program. There's an interesting topic of discussion that could be opened up about whether and how, and I'm saying this as an institution that doesn't issue specific funding calls, but does it make sense to try to, engage funders in conversations to basically, establish that engaging in discussions of innovative modes of dissemination is a legitimate grant expense in various programs. I can't say whether that's a plausible way of going, but you can do that. Again, I feel like funding often is responsive to a push from communities, and when there are priorities from research communities that are well articulated and pushed, this sounds Pollyanna-ish, I know, but I think that's still the best strategy forward. But I'd also defer to others who have maybe more realistic views.
Oh, yeah, sorry, we have one more here.
Yeah, so I'd love to engage with that just a little bit, because it's part of what we've been trying to explore in terms of sustainability models and funding models for communities. And there are some actual examples out there that we can look to. We don't have to just invent it ourselves, but I do think it requires partnerships of funding that we don't think about right now. So already the way that the questions have been posed to the panel so far presuppose that we are talking to the funders, and we're going to ask the funders questions about how we should fund things. I would turn that back to us. I think the question is, as a community, where can we start, and what responsibility do we have to start funding some of the facilitation component or the meeting component ourselves, and then have that coordination that we are producing and our collective voice be there to advocate for projects that fit within the schemes that we've devised for where we want to move forward as a group. So one of the models that I've seen implemented time and time again is membership models that are not, heavy-handed membership models that are tiered appropriately and that allow institution-level interests to pay in small amounts in order to accomplish big things in terms of just aligning interests, which I think is what you're talking about.
Grab the mic to point to all the folks involved in the Force 11, well, you all are, right? And everybody, to say maybe this is a very important point for us to take forward and to think about. We're all here not because we were funded to come to Force 11 in many cases, but because we were funded to do something else and we found this was useful to do that something else. So let's start thinking about how do we formulate the coming here and the things that Force 11 wants to do as a fundable community. I just think that's a useful point to take forward. All right, I didn't mean to grab the mic. Cameron's next. Yeah.
So I wanted to start just by really emphasising what Catherine said. So many of you have heard me do this shtick before, so I'll do it quickly. But I started my life, before I came to my current job, I've been a faculty at the University of Southampton, and I also worked in a funder for 5 years. When I was a faculty member, I knew that all the problems in the world were the fault of two people, the funders and the publishers. And when I was at a funder, I knew that problems were all the fault of either the publishers or the faculty. And it won't escape you notice that I now work for a publisher. So the point of what is it we can do, and this is relevant to the answer I want to give to Phil, or the sort of meta answer. So my answer is infrastructure. Yeah, we need to figure out how to fund the environment. But I want to ask a slightly meta question, which is that we have mechanisms for funding infrastructures and systems, in particular in the scholarly communications space, of various types. And some of those are funded and supported by funding agencies as part of a research program. But we seem to have two modes of doing this. We either go in really heavy on the big, the PDBs, the systems, the PubMed Centrals. We fund them right up front. We make sure these are community things because they're really important and everyone agrees they're really important until someone decides they're not, then we stop funding them and they fall over, but that's a separate issue. Or we do the opposite, which is, and this is, I think, a challenge slightly, Amy's point yesterday about waiting for everything to settle down, that we wait so long that the only people who can move into that space are private enterprise. I've got nothing against private enterprise as a concept, but William Gunn made this amazing statement which has really stuck with me. By the time the research community realises something's valuable enough that we should own it, control it and look after it in the long term, we can no longer afford it. And so the meta question I want to ask is, this problem of environments and infrastructures and human infrastructures and social infrastructures or technical infrastructures, how can we find ways to bridge that gap? Because private funding is great for some things, and enterprise funding is great for some things, and centralised research infrastructure funding from big funders and medium-sized funders and small funders is great for other things as well. But we leave this huge gap in the middle. And what can we do, what systems could we put in place to fill that space and help, again, transition these things from one thing to another? And what does it mean for the community to decide to buy a private startup because it's become core to what the community needs, and how would we raise the money for doing that, for instance?
Oh, sorry. Well, since I've got the microphone, I'll just jump in quickly. I mean, I think increasingly we're seeing each other as not separate sectors. We're kind of, in the past, I think people have tended to work in their own, so you were either a funder or you were either a HEI or you were either a researcher or a publisher. And you see, I think increasingly there are models where people are engaging more with, so we're doing quite a lot of work with digital science now, which we traditionally haven't done, and working with the other big publishers. And so I think there is a bit of, it just takes more effort, I think, to actually sort of see each other's world a bit more and get more involved with and build collaborations, because here it is completely multi-sector. Just having that conversation starts it off, but I do think there is more willingness to work cross-sector now. We, as a funder, are increasingly funding startups and companies building on the research that we funded, but we do see we're funding business people now, we're not just funding researchers. So there is creep and a lot of movement now, I think, in cross-sector working.
I mean, I do think there is some level of spectrum that already exists. It's not quite, all here or all there, but it's certainly not as smooth and as it should be. And I was just thinking about, there are resources and infrastructure that develops around individual or a very small group of researchers that gets to the point where it becomes compelling enough that it becomes actually then part of a consortium. So that's sort of an intermediate step. And then, then it becomes institutionalized either within the federal agencies or within a private institution, and there's some level of presumed continued funding. So that sort of, but I agree with you, I don't think we do a good enough job of that. And one of the things that hasn't really sort of come up in this, but really I think ought to be on the table, is the idea that that happens in collaboration with the private sector, and that we have much more of that at each of the stages, in fact.
You're handing me the microphone on purpose? I support that, of course. And I think it would be interesting to now take a moment and sort of turn it around, because these are excellent questions, and I think they're incredibly interesting also to take forward for Force 11 as a community beyond this room, etc. But I do very much have in mind Phil's original goal, which was to ask, so how do you think it should be done? And there are a number of questions that came up. How do we fund communities? How do we fund infrastructures? And I think I'd just like to take a moment to open it up for people not to ask new questions, but to try to respond on thoughts from people in the audience to these questions. So don't be the tiger used to the concrete cage. I thought that was a very gripping image. Roam into the fields and think of how can this, so sustainable careers, community efforts, and scalable infrastructure that's still innovative. What are thoughts on how that could or should be funded? Is that all right? Let's throw it out. So these are responses, right? Not new questions. Yeah, go ahead. Is that a response to this point?
I just wanted to ask a question.
So can we postpone that? Is that all right?
Sure.
I know we had a number of questioners lined up, and we will get to those, and if we don't, we'll get to them over the tea. But I want to make sure that it's not just questions coming in, answers going out, but both really bi-directional conversations. So thank you. So I think Dave and then Peter.
Okay. So to come back to Melissa's sort of initial query and sort of an implicit response from Amy and Phil, I think there are mechanisms, granting mechanisms, that are mutable sufficiently to look at something like this. So if you consider the infrastructure generated by a major instrumentation grant or anything that NCRR was doing before it got dismantled, those were not directly conducting science. Those were catalyzing science. but the agencies funded them. A U grant is a cooperative agreement where the agency is looking to accomplish a goal that they need the external partners on. I mean, I think SciSip is a good example of activity within NSF where they're trying to understand the activities of science. It sounds like Wellcome is interested in comparable things. I think we could, if the agencies had clean targets, coming back to posing the challenge to the community, if the community came at the agencies, both public and private, with a construct that could be somehow aligned with the existing mechanisms, we could play it.
Any comments, questions, responses? Nods is good too.
It's a good idea. You did make me think of something that's perhaps slightly tangential, but I think it's worth pointing out, because I think there is a growing sense of dynamism in the system, and particularly because of the current situation with funding and everything else, to try new things. So the one that came to mind is that, I think there's a lot of agreement that the current funding models that are project-based create enormous competition in the system that is in some degrees unhealthy. So, there's experiments going on in our own institution to actually fund investigators in the same way that they're not represented here, but the way that Howard Hughes Medical Institute has done, for example. So there's nothing to say in that context in funding an investigator that investigator couldn't actually use that to stimulate a community or, something else for that matter. There's a bit of a risk in that if it doesn't particularly go well, because it reflects quite a lot on that individual. But it's a sign that there are these new kinds of funding things being tried, at least, and evaluated.
You can't comment on an individual idea, and I'm not a program officer. So, with those two disclaimers, I would just, again, remind you that you have to submit recognizing the agency's mission, and NSF's mission is support of advanced research. So to the extent that there is sophisticated infrastructure or research community networks that enable that research to go forward, I think you can find a sympathetic audience. And we have specific programs on research on RCNs and a social, behavioral, and economic sciences directorate where I was. We had one that was specifically on building capacity and demonstrating that there was a set of researchers interested in going after a topic and doing that in a coordinated way. But I emphasize that this is in support of research. And inevitably, it hits the moment where it goes into operations. And inevitably, how do we keep it going beyond, going after the research? And that is simply a challenge in the system.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes, and I've got an order of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll start collecting other people.
Yes, 2 points related to maybe not exactly what to fund, but how to fund it or how to prioritize it. So the first one is on cross-disciplinary research. So a lot of the work that we see here, the initiatives have come from maybe computer science working with the library, or even astronomy working with social science, and all kind of cross-disciplinary work efforts that bring the initiative from one discipline to another. So the importance of prioritizing based on that might bring work that is done by communities like that more into the front. It is almost critical for the current stage of science, right? But the conflict I see with that, or the contradiction, is that a lot of the, not all the cases, but many of the cases that where you look at what it's funded, it's by funding stars within a discipline. And so that still prevails, and then it is hard to fund an effort that it's a mix of many disciplines. And one more point is related to also in terms of prioritizing funding, that I don't find as important to bring the numbers so that there are as many women as men funded, as BIs, but it is important. I would say that what it is important though is to find an environment in research that invites women to participate in research, and that could be a collaborative team, something that doesn't require necessarily a competition or some leadership that is more seen in traits of men.
Anybody to respond to that?
I guess I'm on dangerous ground here. I would say that at the time that I started NIH 9 months ago, we also started an office within the Office of the Director on diversity, both for gender diversity and for racial diversity. And there's been a lot of interactions between a number of things that many people are doing, including what we're doing in data science, in the belief of really trying to address this issue. In fact, I'm writing, as we speak, or more or less, with Fran Berman, a piece that because we see this as a very significant problem, and it's definitely something we want to try and address. On your cross-disciplinary thing, I would say that, again, I'll be shooting myself in the foot probably. I'll probably get fired, but I think the way that things are set up within a lot of funding agencies, it doesn't really foster this kind of cross-disciplinary because the money comes through a set of silos where in the NIH context, the way we deal with that is a thing called the Common Fund, which does fund a lot of, like BRAIN, for example, or big data. They're these multidisciplinary things, so they are happening, and that's sort of the way it's dealt with. But I don't actually have a story, but I won't go into it because I can see Dan's looking at his watch.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the diversity front, the other side of the coin is making sure that people who are doing the peer review and people sitting on committees and judging the grants, making sure that we have enough diversity there as well, and that's something that funding agencies are increasingly looking at. So it's not just what's coming in, it's kind of making sure that people aren't deterred by lower response rates and award rates, so therefore making sure that the decision making is also diverse. And that does include disciplinaries. I think agencies are increasingly looking to try and build multidisciplinary expertise on panels, and also co-opt more people onto panels when they don't have to actually be there now. We're doing more outreach to people if there's a grant application that comes in that really doesn't have someone in that room that isn't maybe equipped to judge it in the way that it should be, getting experts from externally. But again, that's trying to balance the need for doing that with researcher burdens and peer review burdens and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting kind of field. Matching peer review grants to peer review is important, time consuming.
So yes, I would agree that an important component of this is looking at the composition of the review panels, so that bias that you aren't even aware existed may exist. Consciously, with the best will in the world, you mitigate against that. On the interdisciplinary front, multidisciplinary front, this is a topic that I spent a lot of time on in the 2010-2012 period, and I've been watching at an institutional level for a number of years. And I think that although when you do have an interdisciplinary topic or something that seems to fall in between, it feels hard. Actually, the program officers work very hard to try to overcome what seems to be a silo that's created by the necessary accounting. So let's sort of revert to my favorite topic of silos. Sometimes silos are our friends. This is public money. You have to account for it. You have to code it somehow. So we have to live with silos. The question becomes, can you work across the silos in a constructive way? And what you see is through various informal mechanisms that may not be visible to you, the program officers work very hard to compensate for a deficit that may be created by the institutional framework. And they do that by talking to each other. They do that for sending it out for additional review. They do that in as many ways as they can. So there are informal mechanisms that it doesn't salve the wound when you get rejected and you feel that it's been unfair. But from our side of the table, we work very hard to overcome the necessary silo.
To release a data point without any narrative, we have about 5 minutes more to go. And
Peter Mayrust, I'd like to take up the 2 points of infrastructure and startups. Now, I've worked in industry. I believe in industry. I believe at the moment that we are We have a crippling lack of infrastructure here. Academia generally can't do it. So we had the cyber infrastructure, the e-science programs, and they really, apart from people like Carol here, they didn't give anything lasting for the community. The bioscientists have managed this, most of the other disciplines haven't. So what's happening is that uncontrolled mega private industry is now building the networks of scholarship. And the primary ones are the publishers and para-publishers, particularly Elsevier and Digital Science. Now, as I say, I have nothing against companies in general, but I do against unregulated companies which are not answerable. So none of these organizations have any answerability to us. They can do what they like. We have no control over the way they do things, what they design, and so on. So we are ending up both with the control of the networks, which may include a large degree of snooping on what we do, whether they say it or not, and also they direct our thought by the tools they produce. So if you think Facebook, Google, they dictate how we see our world at the moment. The same is true of the way the publishers are going. And if you don't do something about it, then we're going to end up as really pawns in this large infrastructure we can't control.
This one's dead.
Dead? I'm sorry.
Oh, just this one. We're all alive.
Well, Peter, I would say that this is actually partly the discussion I'm going to have in my bit at the end. So I won't talk about it now, but not to get you to stay, but because I actually feel the same somewhat of this. I wouldn't be quite as very forthright about it as you are, but well, I used to be. What's happened to me? Oh God! But I will say something about that later. I don't want to take time on it now.
Okay, over here.
I thought when you started with infrastructure, my name's Stefan Tanaka at UCSD, and I'm one of the historians, humanists. I'm in a communication department, so I thought your comment about infrastructure was going to be very different from mine. But since we deal with discourse and its relationship to politics and economics, it's very much aligned with that. I was at Amsterdam where Phil, Marianne were very generous in making sure that the humanistic and social sciences were welcome here. And we're interlopers, welcome interlopers in this conference. There's more, but what I find interesting about this one is that there's less specific topics on the humanities and social sciences. But the problems as we think about the future always come back to social and historical problems. And Catherine, I thought you hit it on the head when you're talking about habituation and change coming from the fringe rather than the middle, where we all, I mean, admit it, we're all here because we've been successful at the middle. And we're better than that because we're here. But in thinking about moving forward, I think we have to take the questions of the social and the cultural and historical a little bit more, put it up front, because they then get into epistemological and problems that we've naturalized in our practices and lead to some of the discussions that have been, I thought, a lot of fun, but you know, they didn't go in the direction I thought they were going to go.
You're speaking to one of my favorite ironies. So as a scholar, and I was in an interdisciplinary program, and I was asking, fairly untraditional questions when I was there. But the thing that frustrated me the most is what led me into this field, which is more, I work between the libraries and the publishers and scholars at this point. And the reason that I moved out of scholarship and into action is because I couldn't do the studies that I wanted to in the academy of the academy. And nobody else was willing to do it alongside me. And it was infuriating because it was so clear to me, and I was being called Chicken Little by others, but it was so clear to me in 1999 when I was getting started that the sky was frickin' falling. That there is no way, and I mean, Peter Murray Rust, you're nailing it. I mean, there's a reciprocal relationship always between the form of communication, the mode of communication, and what gets communicated. So it's not just that the newspaper publishes the news and then history continues on. It's that we read the news and we're influenced by the way that that comes through, and it impacts the way that we behave. Same thing is true with scholarship. And so there is this very dangerous situation that I think is already very much in motion. And one of the things that I've been excited about, again, being a part of this conversation over the last 2 days, is that I think there are a lot of people in this room that get that. And if that's the case, then the question is, how do we figure out a better way to work together so that we articulate this in a way that actually carries things forward, instead of continuing to have small innovations, which are important, but no system-wide change, which I think is mandatory right now if we're going to have scholarship in the next century that's worthwhile.
And I can add something actually about the Force 11 side of things. I think, moving maybe a little bit away from the funding in this case. I think, first of all, the fact this isn't called Beyond the PDF is part of the response to that, for reasons that have come up at other times. But I think, I think we are nailing hitting the nail on the head. And what we have here that's actually, I think, unique, it's come out in a large sense out of biological sciences and neuroscience. But one of the questions we've been trying to ask in the Future Commons, for example, is we are actually quite unique in the sense that we actually know how other people do stuff in their silos, whereas nobody else does. So when we were doing the Future Common work group, we had as an assumption that there was a commonality across the board. And then just as we got to the end, somebody said, actually, do we know there's common? And I don't think we do. Speaking as an editor and a publisher of humanities journals, I know how science journals work because I'm in Force 11, but I know a lot of people who have no idea, and vice versa. So I think that partially, this is the group for that. I think you and me and you and, those of us who are on the HSS side of things have to kind of speak up a little bit more in the group, but I certainly see it moving, moving that way.
Phil, as appropriate, has the last word.
So, I feel for what Stefan's saying. I think, but I have to say that this is the kind of discussion we've had at previous of these meetings as well. And I'd say that the fact that there's more representation from broader disciplines is good, but we have an enormous, I think there's a long way to go. I think there's an specific example. Who here is representing a university administrative role where they have some oversight of the institution? One. Well, when I asked that question last time, oh, sorry, two. That's all right. It's an improvement. I was the only one, and I think these are the kinds of people, these kinds of subgroups, many types of groups of people need to be brought into this fold. And I think the Force 11 folks, you ought to be really thinking about a structure that's going to really enable that if this is going to, in my personal view, move and continue to move in the right direction. So I think working groups that bring in and engage different communities would be one way of doing it, but I'm sure there are lots of other ways, and I would encourage you to have that discussion.
So I should just say, last time we had one funder, and now look at how many we have. And the whole time you were sitting there, I said, the next group I want up there are the university administrators. Yeah. So we will work on it.
That's great. Thank you all. Thank you to the funders and the speaker chair.